This is going to be a quick lecture on growth, development, and sport for KIN401, Principles of Coaching 2. So why should we study growth and development in the sport context? In the past, growth and development have really been used as a way to identify more talented athletes or athletes who may be more likely to show success at higher levels of sport. But today, we don't really do that as much, and our knowledge of growth and development can help us create healthier sport environments. So we're going to talk a little bit about physical growth and maturation, and we're going to start by talking about the basic phases of growth for the average human being. And again, I want to indicate that these are average growth curves. We're talking not about specific people, but human growth on the average. There are 4 different phases of human growth. Infancy, which lasts for the first 2 years of growth, is characterized by relatively rapid growth that typically levels off around 2 years of age. Childhood is typically between the ages of 2 and 11 or 12, depending on the beginning of the adolescent growth spurt. But childhood growth is very regular. On average, children grow about 2.5 inches per year during childhood and grow relatively equal in both the upper body and the lower body. The adolescent growth period, which can begin as early as age 10 for some children and oftentimes as late as age 15 or 16, that would be sort of the upper extreme. The adolescent growth spurt is generally characterized by more growth in the torso. The legs tend to grow at the same level or same rate of growth, but the torso grows at a much more accelerated rate of growth. And then after the adolescent growth spurt, typically you don't see any gains in height after that, and that's typically what marks the progression into adulthood. You can see here, if you follow the arrow of my pointer here, this is the typical human height growth curve. So as you can see, height grows relatively rapidly up to about 2 years and kind of levels off into this regular growth area. But then you see this, again, this upward track around adolescence, typically between ages 10 and 14. Girls are usually in the middle of their adolescent growth spurt around the age of 11, and boys are typically in the middle of the adolescent growth spurt around the age of 13. This is just another way of representing the growth spurt, but this is what's called a velocity curve. So this is talking about the rate of growth, how much height change occurs in a year. And as you can see, growth is actually fastest in the first 2 years of growth and then just slows down to a very regular rate of growth in childhood. So typically between the ages of 4 and about 10 or 11, that growth is very regular. Then you can see this dotted line right here is when girls typically grow. And one of the things that you notice here is that girls, they grow earlier, but they don't grow as fast as boys do. So boys grow later and grow very fast when they're in their adolescent growth spurt. Girls, it's a little more regular. You still see the adolescent growth spurt. Of course, this means that girls are typically finished growing by the age of 15 or 16, whereas most boys are still maturing somewhat or still growing even at the end of, say, the high school years, ages 17 and 18. So let's talk a little bit more about variability in human growth. Growers are typically, or I should say, children are typically categorized into early, middle, and late maturers, or average maturers for middle maturers. Typically what's seen, and this is, again, a very generalized graph that you're looking at right here, but you can see that early maturing people grow early. Their adolescent growth spurt occurs before the average person. But what you can see here, and if you look at this top curve, this is the early maturing growth. They typically grow the fastest, but then they stop. And then once they reach adulthood, typically around 18 or 19 years, they end up being shorter on average than middle maturers or late maturers. You can see the line here in the middle. You typically see this growth spurt beginning around about 12 years of age in this case, and leveling off a little bit later than the early mature. And then here you see the late mature. And the late mature doesn't have as much of a growth spurt, but they end up being much taller on average than their peers. And the reason for this is simple. Before the adolescent growth spurt, the legs and the torso are growing at roughly the same rates. But during the adolescent growth spurt, the torso is what grows. But you see the late matures, they have a few more years of leg growth. Okay, so if you hit your growth spurt around 14 years of age as compared to, say, 11 years of age, then typically what happens is that your legs have grown for a much longer period of time, and that adds a little height to your final height, which ends up being up here. So late matures, they grow late, they typically have more leg growth, and that leads to usually a higher final height than an early mature. So that leads us to our question. Of course, you should definitely be able to know what accounts for the final height difference between late maturing and early maturing individuals.